This is episode 6 of That Shakespeare Life.
And this argument by pamphlet went on for such a long time that the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think, in the end had to intervene to stop it.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In 16th century London, rivalries among theater companies were fierce, and equal rivalries existed among famous actors. Richard Burbage was the famous actor of Shakespeare's company, and Edward Alleyn gave him a run for his money. In this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Edward Alleyn and his role in theater during Shakespeare's time. It is rumored that Edward Alleyn was so famous that when he retired in 1598, Queen Elizabeth personally requested his return to the stage. Join us this week as we look into the life of this interesting character who was a contemporary of William Shakespeare. Pauline Montagna is a writer, author, and student of history. Her latest book is titled Not Wisely But Too Well, which, among several controversial claims, makes the case that Edward Alleyn and not Shakespeare was the upstart crow insulted famously by Robert Greene. This latest book is the novel version of her first book, Deconstructing Shakespeare, which was a nonfiction book detailing her research that she would use to write about Shakespeare's start as a playwright in London. Based in Melbourne, Australia, and a self-described practical-minded writer, Pauline has self-published 10 books, the most recent of which have focused on the early life of William Shakespeare. She joins us today to unpack one of the lesser-known contemporaries of Shakespeare, the life of Edward Alleyn, who rivaled Richard Burbage for the title of most famous actor in England during the 17th century. Hello, Pauline. Lovely to have you.
Thank you, Cassidy. My pleasure.
Pauline, your story is a unique one, from French major to college to bookkeeper and now published author. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to write about Shakespeare.
I guess it was accidental, like most of my other great moves in life. I just happened to be wandering around my local library one day and saw a book called Who Wrote Shakespeare by John Michel. And I sort of vaguely heard about the great authorship debate. So I picked up this book and I was really quite fascinated by the whole subject about, the Stratfordians who defend Shakespeare's honour and the anti-Stratfordians who defend their myriad candidates to be the person who really wrote Shakespeare. Then after that, not long after that, there was a documentary called Much Ado About Something, which was about the Marlowe's claim to be the real Shakespeare. And soon after that, we were discussing it in my book group, and we just read the Da Vinci Code. And someone said, "Oh, Pauline, why don't you write a thriller about who wrote Shakespeare?" And I thought, well, I don't know about a thriller. I mean, who would kill someone about whether or not Shakespeare, who wrote Shakespeare? And then I didn't think I could write a thriller. I really like to let my characters eat and sleep now and again. But it did get me thinking about whether it would make a good novel, and especially about the relationship between Shakespeare and Marlowe.
Well, the one you've written is very interesting, and I know that while he's a minor character in your novel, you do take the effort to include Edward Alleyn. And I wonder why, or what rather, did you learn that caused you to find him worth including?
Well, basically, you couldn't write a novel about the Elizabethan theatre without including Edward Alleyn. When Shakespeare arrived in London, he was probably the most famous actor at the time. He was a great tragedian, and he was playing in all the major roles in Christopher Marlowe's plays, and Christopher Marlowe was the darling of the London theatre at the time. And his life intersected with Shakespeare, or basically intersected with the Burbages, and Shakespeare was with the Burbages. The two families had this huge falling out in 1590, which caused a great upheaval in the London theatre. And it was because of the rivalry between those two families, I believe, that we ended up with two major London theatres after 1594. that when the London theatres were reorganised after the plague in 1594, that they had to have two London theatres rather than one. So you had the Lord Admiral's men with the Alleyns, and you had the Lord Chamberlain's men with the Burbages.
Well, in her book, Pauline makes the case that it was indeed Edward Alleyn and not Shakespeare that Robert Greene was insulting in his famous Groat's Worth of Wit declaration. Pauline, I wonder if you could explain briefly what was most convincing, or the nail in the coffin type evidence that really turned you towards thinking Edward Alleyn would have been the upstart crow.
Well, the nail in the coffin is the fact that only recently the new Oxford Shakespeare has named Christopher Marlowe as the co-author of the Henry VI trilogy. But before that, well, this claim actually goes back to about 1926. And the most convincing argument was made by A.D. Raitt, who is one of Marlowe's biographers. And she looks at the whole pamphlet, not just that one paragraph. The paragraph that the Shakespearean scholars have bounced on contains just 2 points that they think refers to Shakespeare. And one is a parody of a line from Henry VI, and the other is the term shake scene. Now, if we just first take shake scene, even if you just read the rest of that paragraph, you'll see that when when Greene is referring to his antagonist and his ilk, he uses terms that are derogatory terms for actors. He talks about puppets, antics, crows. And shake scene is just another word for actor. I mean, it's someone who shakes the stage. Sometimes these days we talk about an actor who eats the scenery. Well, a shake scene would have been something like that. And then, of course, if we look at the line from Henry VI, now that we know that Marlowe was one of the authors, at the time Marlowe was the most successful author on the London stage. He'd already had several big hits. He had a university education. Shakespeare was this country bumpkin that had, just had a couple of plays under his belt, and someone that Robert Greene would not even have considered. So when he was parodying that line, he was thinking about the author of the play being Christopher Marlowe. So basically, he's parodying his friend Christopher Marlowe, who is Edward Alleyn's favourite author, stealing other people's work. He was talking about an actor who takes the plays written by playwrights, presents them on stage, and gets all of the credit for them, and then pays the playwrights very little. And that's basically what that whole pamphlet is about.
So we know that Richard Burbage was Shakespeare's lead actor, and we've talked about Edward Alleyn and how he was with Marlowe, but Pauline, please explain to us the role of a lead actor in Elizabethan theater. How was Edward basically Marlowe's Burbage, in the sense that what was this role of lead actor? Why did these companies have this person?
Well, the only lead actors I can talk about with any authority are Edward Alleyn and Richard Burbage, and they were very different men and worked in very different ways. Alleyn was much more of the actor entrepreneur. He ran his theatre. Philip Henslowe, who actually owned the theatre, had very little to do with the running of it. Edward Alleyn ran it with his brother John. And most plays were actually owned by the company, but Edward Alleyn himself bought plays, so he actually bought Marlowe's plays himself. Meanwhile, Richard Burbage, he was part of a theatrical family. He was much more a collegiate type. It was his father who built the theatre and ran the theatre until then later his older brother took over. Richard Burbage was just one of many sharers who owned the theatre, or then later on the Globe, and Lord Chamberlain's men. So they were quite different kinds of people, but usually any kind of theatre company at that time would have leaders, but those theatre companies were mostly run as cooperatives, and so they might have a star actor, but he didn't have the kind of actor entrepreneurial role that maybe actors had in the 18th and 19th century.
Clarify for us about the theaters. We know Shakespeare had the Globe Theatre, but we keep referencing Alleyn and Marlowe and that they had their own theatre, but which one was that?
They had the Rose. Now, the Rose Theatre was actually built and owned by Philip Henslowe. It was south of the river, and in 1592, Edward Alleyn moved in with Lord Strange's men, but before he moved in, the theatre was renovated and enlarged and a turret was added. At that stage, the Burbages were north of the river with the theatre. It wasn't until 1599 that they moved south of the river. So there was, the big theatre south of the river was the Rose, and the one north of the river was the theatre.
It's easy to think of Alleyn, Henslowe, and Marlowe as competition. So, you've got one in the north and one in the south. They're obviously competing for the audience and competing for the theater tickets there in London.
Mm-hmm.
But didn't Alleyn actually perform in some of Shakespeare's plays? I know you mentioned a falling out before. Were they friendly at some point?
No, not really. Alleyn was only ever in one of Shakespeare's plays, which is Titus Andronicus. But Titus Andronicus was actually owned by Lord Strange's men. And it only just happened that when Lord Strange's and Lord Admiral's companies had to do a joint season, that Alleyn would have picked up Titus Andronicus and then eventually taken it with him when he went with it when he joined Lord Strange's men. But I think after that he was able to acquire it for himself, because he did take it with him when he did a short stint with Lord Sussex's men during the Christmas season of 1593-94.
Which play was Edward Alleyn most well known for?
He was most well known for Christopher Marlowe's plays. Tamburlaine the Great was his probably biggest role. Then he was also famous for Dr. Faustus and for Barabbas in The Rich Jew of Malta.
How do we know this much about him? I mean, are there contemporary reviews?
Yes. Apparently, A.D. Raitt, who also has written about Edward Alleyn, says that there was actually more published about Edward Alleyn and Tarleton than about any other actors at the time.
Wow,
but also, yes, also Edward Alleyn founded in his later years, when he was a very rich man, he established a grammar school in Dulwich. Dulwich Grammar is still there, and it holds an archive of all of his documents, letters and documents, and it also includes a diary which he kept from 1617 onwards. So there is actually probably more of a record of Edward Alleyn than there is of Shakespeare or even Richard Burbage.
That's really surprising to me with such a volume of information. What is your opinion on his popularity? Why is it that Burbage and Shakespeare are sort of the popular ones, whereas Alleyn gets kind of forgotten and overlooked when obviously he played a huge role in the time period?
Basically because we've made a secular saint of William Shakespeare. He dominates our understanding of the Elizabethan theatre to the point where everybody else is pretty much neglected. It's Shakespeare and nobody else. It's taken a lot of scholarship to find out about his contemporaries, and all of the records have been combed for any mention of William Shakespeare, and everybody else is pretty much ignored. The only people that have been studied are people that at some point touched Shakespeare's life. And that's why, for instance, we know a lot about Robert Greene, but we don't know much about Edward Alleyn.
Well, what is the one thing you feel is most important to know about contemporaries of Shakespeare? And this can just be from the research you did for writing your book. What was maybe the most important thing you came away with?
Basically, that Shakespeare was just another author, another playwright in his time. He worked with other playwrights. When he first started, he collaborated with playwrights that were senior to him, people like Thomas Kidd and Christopher Marlowe. And then as he got older, he collaborated with the younger generation and passed his wisdom on to them. He was not your lone genius working in a garret by himself. He was part of a popular entertainment industry. And you really can't compare Shakespeare to our modern playwrights. If you're going to compare him to anyone, you should compare him to a screenwriter. And like screenwriters, screenwriters have to churn out scripts. They're not necessarily about their favourite subject, but the subjects that are required. When they sell their scripts, they've got no control over what happens to them. Their scripts might be based on stories that come from other mediums. They might be based on older scripts. Screenwriters might find themselves fixing up other people's scripts or find out that their own scripts have been fixed up by other authors. So we have to look at Shakespeare in his time, in his context, and we can't think of him in the same way as we would think of a playwright today.
Well, Pauline, thank you so much for being here today and giving us this exceptional look at Shakespeare and his contemporaries. I know we will be looking forward to some of that scholarship to explore people like Edward Alleyn just a little bit more than maybe we did before. I appreciate your time today.
Okay, thank you very much, Cassidy. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.